This is Corey Johnston, and today's message will be on the hidden meanings of parables. Parables are instructive illustrations that use familiar imagery or incidents from nature or everyday experience as analogous examples to illuminate new didactic truths in a more lifelike manner than it is possible by explicit precept or general abstraction. The author of parables must creatively concoct counterintuitive connections between commonly observed natural phenomena of creation and less commonly intuited spiritual principles by means of imaginary yet relatable narrative incidents. Because Yahshua is master of both matter and spirit, he was intimately familiar with both, enough so to make the former text and illustrations for the latter. Any experience of everyday life may be exalted as the vehicle of transcendent truth. The lesson given is imagined by the eyes and imprinted on the memory, and made all the more emphatic in the process of this activity. Through parables, the pedantic may be elevated to the profound, the trivial to the transcendent, and the mundane to the miraculous. This method of teaching compels the recipient of the message to discover the truth for themselves through independent inquiry and internal interpretations of the implicit external message. The truth of the message reaches only those who are willing to listen, learn, and discern matters of spiritual substance. To understand spiritual truth, writes Cunningham Geikie, the heart must be in sympathy with it. Otherwise, to try to explain it would be as idle as to speak of colors to the blind or of music to the deaf. When the religious faculty was dead or dormant, religious truth was necessarily incomprehensible and undesired. It was not by accident that the Savior introduced this method of teaching when there was violent opposition mounted against him, when the vendetta of the ruling religious authorities, the scribes, the Pharisees, and the rabbis, had erupted into active and open hostility, and were maintaining a diligent oversight on his movements and a studious watch on his works, determined to prove and expose him as an offender in word. Prior to that time, his doctrines had been presented in unveiled simplicity, as we witness the explicit declarations of the Sermon of the Mount. His old methods of teaching, however, were not the most appropriate for the new circumstances of his ministry. During the prior period to the Messiah's mortal ministry, his fame had been on the rise on account of the authority with which he spoke and of the many miracles he had performed. His popularity was such that whenever he set foot, crowds abound to hear the teacher or witness the healer. One of the consequences of this mass enthusiasm was the exceeding difficulty for efficiently espousing of his message. Occasion demanded the introduction of simple stories to illustrate profound doctrines. The use of parables had been in circulation since the pre-monarchical age of judges and was a common practice among his contemporary Jewish teachers. Thus, by implementing this mode of instruction, the Savior was really mimicking a customary practice, though the parables he spoke were without parallel in profundity, so much so that Geikie succinctly writes, "Others have uttered parables, but Jesus so far transcends them that he may justly be called the creator of this mode of instruction." It was a peculiarly Jewish methodology of teaching. Rarely would the rabbis teach in plain words, and we are thus expressly told that Yahshua submitted to this personal taste, so much so that at one point, and he was not speaking to them without parables, and when they were alone, he explained all to his disciples. Mark 4:34. The main message of the Master's parables were illustrations for the ingredients of faithful and fruitful living. When speaking in parables, the Master was not concealing truths from sincere seekers of the same, because those who were spiritually perceptive were naturally intuitive to the subterranean meaning. This method enabled the Savior to provide spiritual food to those who hungered for it, while preventing his enemies from trapping him prematurely to the Father's will. This method conceals the hidden truth from those too hard-hearted or prejudiced to discern the hidden message. Some people gathered in the crowds he attracted were only looking for evidence to trap the Savior, while others only wanted to learn and grow. The teacher's words were for the honest seekers. A paraphrased principle we may deduce from our plenary analysis of the internal content and external response of and to the Master's parable is that the eye will not see, nor the ear will not hear what the heart is unwilling or unprepared to comprehend. Ergo, in order to maximize the edification, it is incumbent that we are to circumcise our hearts, lest the message escape us. And you shall circumcise the foreskins of your heart, and harden your neck no more, we read in Deuteronomy 10:16. Circumcise yourselves unto Yahweh, and take away the foreskins of your heart, you men of Judah and inhabitants of Jerusalem, lest my wrath come forth like fire and burn, with none to quench it, because of the evils of your deed. The prophet Jeremiah advises us in the fourth verse of the 4th chapter in the book that bears his name. This spiritual surgery will remove any callousness that may inhibit our understanding. This we must do in preparation to receive the message of the Messiah. To be circumcised of the flesh is no substitute for the circumcision that truly matters, in the heart. We must submit to a heart transplant that will replace the hard heart of the old carnal nature with one that is soft, pliable, trusting, and receptive. Our hearts can become rigid and prevent us from accepting the new life that the Messiah offers us through his message. We must keep our hearts open and pliable to accepting the life-transforming truths of the good news. We must submit ourselves to the Father, both inside the hearts as well as outside our bodies. Then our commitment will be written on our souls, not just our bodies. In him, meaning the Savior, Paul writes, you are also circumcised with the circumcision, not made with hands, in the putting off of the body of the sins of the flesh, by the circumcision of the Messiah. Colossians 2:11. The divine word must be understood before it can penetrate the heart and release its transformational power. But we must also prepare the heart, lest we fail to grasp mentally the message. Divine guidance can only come to prepared hearts. We must condition our hearts to be receptive to divine direction. We must break up the hardness of our hearts as plow breaks up rocky soil. For when our hearts become hardened by sin, we must remove the sin that hardens the heart, so that the seed of the faith may be planted, take root, and flourish unto fruitfulness. We must guard our hearts from becoming so rigid that they prevent us from accepting the new ways of transformed living that the Messiah brings. We must maintain our heart's pliability to receive the Savior's life-changing message. Then and only then will our mind be able to intuit the message that our ears hear. The Master adapted these methods according to his audience's abilities and desire to comprehend. He who had come as the light of the world came to reveal truth, not to conceal it. His purpose in speaking in parables was not to confuse people, but to challenge sincere believers to attentively reflect and discern the mystery and discover the meaning of his words. Had the Savior spoken in plain indictment of the hypocrisy and wickedness of the ruling religious authorities, his public ministry would have been terminated prematurely. Those with attentive ears and discerning hearts were able to understand the message that he delivered. That the meaning of the parables were understandable through attentive study, search, and prayer was intimated in the teacher's admonishment. He who has ears to hear, let him hear, he says in various locations throughout the Gospels. To the more studious inquirers, the master advised, and he said to them, "Take heed what you hear. With the same measure you use, it shall be measured to you, and more shall be added to you who hear." Mark 4:24. Turning to the originally recited parable in the Messianic scriptures, which serves as a transition of more to come, we read the master reiterating upon the uselessness of hearing alone by comparing it to the efficacy of doing. The spirit of the peroration to the Sermon of the Mount is praise sincerity in action while condemning empty profession and neglect. Therefore, everyone who hears these words of mine and does them shall be like a wise man who builds his house on the rock. And the rain came down, and the floods came, and the winds blew and beat on that house, and it did not fall, for it was founded on the rock. Matthew 7:24-25. To build upon a rock is to be an obedient disciple on firm footing and sound structure. By practicing this obedience, we may weather the storms of life in the world. Founded on the rock that is the Messiah, we will stand the storm. The promise of blessing is supplemented by a warning. And everyone who hears these words of mine and does not do them shall be like a foolish man who built his house on the sand. And the rain came down, and the floods came, and the winds blew, and they beat the house, and it fell, and great was its fall. Matthew 7:26-27. Obeying the Father is akin to building a house on a strong, solid foundation that stands firm when the storms of life come. When life is calm, our foundations don't seem to make much of a difference. But when crisis comes like a storm, as it inevitably must, our foundations will be tested. We must make sure our life is built on the solid foundation of knowing and trusting the Savior. The life of the foolish and disobedient fair-weather disciples will collapse as a house of cards once the foul weather comes. The majority of people who rest upon this false and inferior foundation do not always necessarily arrive there as the result of a conscious, deliberate choice, but settle on it because they do not devote the serious consideration to the higher purpose of life. Most people headed for destruction do not do so out of stubbornness, but of thoughtlessness. We must rise above such thoughtlessness and encourage others to do the same, for if they do,